Hello, and welcome to this GDC session. I'm going to be talking about the development behind Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. This was a title that was released in the fall of 2020 for all major consoles and PC. And it's a new adventure in the series after a 12-year absence for the franchise. I'm going to be sharing about our approach to developing this new original game for one of the biggest gaming icons of the 90s, and how we took a classic IP that fans have a ton of nostalgia for, made it relevant and fresh while maintaining its authenticity. I'm going to share about the creative direction that led to how we uniquely balanced new and nostalgia. Now, to get started, if we haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Paul. I am the co-studio head at Toys for Bob. I lead the creative art and design teams there. We are a core crew of 70 developers based out of the Bay Area in California, and this is our extended team. We're really blessed to have support from incredibly talented teams and individuals from all over the world, from countries like Germany, France, Canada, Israel, and China, just to name a few. Believe it or not, this year marks the 25th anniversary of Crash, and so I think we're going to have some great things to celebrate further on down in the year, but it's a timely place to talk about the newest game in the series. So before diving in, I think we should start and rewind all the way to the start just to give some context about where this franchise began and where we decided to take it to today. So you're probably familiar with Crash Bandicoot. You probably, at least were familiar or engaged with him as he debuted on the PlayStation in 1996. But you may not have known that every single year after that, there's been a brand new Crash Bandicoot game, at least one, up until 2008. And that's the point at which the IP went a little bit dormant and quiet. And more recently, Activision has remastered the original games in the series. And in 2017, Vicarious Visions did an amazing job remastering the first three games, which they called the Insane Trilogy, and followed in 2019 by Beanox remastering Crash Team Racing. Now, us at Toys for Bob, we played a support role in both these titles. We also remastered another big gaming icon of the 90s in Spyro in 2018. And this is the point at which we start to engage Activision in conversation about a potential new title for 2020. Now, internally, this was being described as a reboot, which suggests a really drastic overhaul. And perhaps that was a term that was being used prematurely. So one thing that we did in these early conversations was to step back for a second, and we wanted to tease out what the real goals of this before we started to embark on this development journey. So one thing that I love to do as an exercise to do this and to put a little bit more precision on fuzzy topics or things that might be a little bit subjective is to use this exercise of spectrums. And spectrums are a great way of putting two extremes on both ends and then lining up ideas and trying to place them physically along those spectrums just to tease out where you might align with other teammates or where you may disagree. So in this case, what we did was we put the term reboot on one end of the spectrum, which suggests reinvention. And then on the other end, we explored this idea of a sequel, which suggests an evolution of ideas or a continuation. And we looked at a whole slew of games that we felt kind of existed along this spectrum. There's examples of successful titles and not so successful titles on both ends of this spectrum. There's nothing inherently right or wrong about where these land, but this was a useful exercise for us to compare and contrast in terms of what are the goals that are unique for Crash Bandicoot and moving that series into the future, into relevancy for today. As an observation of doing this exercise together, we all saw that on the sequel end of things, the opportunity is to be reverent, to really appeal to the core fan base. The risks may be that the titles may not stand out enough, or it may be perceived to be more of the same. On the reboot side of things, there's this huge opportunity for innovation and just wiping the canvas clear and starting fresh. The risks there are that you may alienate the core fan base or introduce something that is unrecognizable. Another lens that we applied is how do these extremes on the spectrum approach fans? And where we kind of concluded on this was that sequels are great positioning for titles that have a strong, thriving, and large existing fan base, where reboots might be one where there's a very specific intention to go after a new audience, or maybe the core fan base has grown out of that and is passing that on to a new generation. So looking at fans for Crash, we had a great benefit of seeing very, very recent results coming out of the recent remasters. And it was actually a little bit surprising how many people showed up and how many people were really excited about these remasters. And the profile of these players are people like myself, mid-20s to early 40s, who were probably 6 to 10 years old when the PlayStation debuted. They have a really strong inner child, and they look fondly at the experiences from their youth. We also looked at the catalog of the whole history of Crash titles up until this point, and one very striking observation was that both critically and commercially, the high point was at the early part of that series. And so another thing that may come out of this is that the memories and the associations and the fondness for this franchise probably all stack at the very front end of this time. So with all these pieces together, we aligned and held hands to say what Crash 2020 is going to be is a sequel to the original trilogy, and it's going to be positioned primarily for the core Crash audience. Now, this is the first major guardrail statement. It's a really big stake in the sand for us, and it really crisped up when we started to call this project Crash 4. So at this point, we were setting up the technical foundations for this new project. We were starting to prototype. We were starting to do concept art, exploring different environments and characters. And this is where another spectrum exercise was really useful for many of our different teams as we started to ask ourselves, what are some things that we can presume this game is? And what are things that we can presume at this early point what this game isn't? So as an example, one thing we know is from our guardrail statement is that this game is going to be for 25 to 40-year-olds. We know that this is a sequel to the original trilogy, and so there's certain elements like the antagonist, the neocortex, and the entropy are going to play a major part. The idea of time travel and just time in general is going to be a strong theme that we want to continue. We also knew on the other side of things what the game isn't is it's not going to be open world. It's not going to be a beat 'em up in the way that some of the latter sequels move gameplay and game design towards. We know that it's not going to have MTX. It just does not jive with what we're trying to do here and what this series has been thus far. And then in the middle, there's a lot of ideas and open questions, personal ambitions that we have for ourselves that we weren't sure. It wasn't as clear in those early days. And so we put them deliberately in the middle, and it was really helpful for us to focus on that. As decisions started to solidify, we could reevaluate and move these unknowns further over to the left or further to the right. Now, our creative director took all of these different conversations across all the different teams, all of these debates, all of these presumptions, and boiled these down into 3 big statements that expressed what this game is about its tone, its gameplay, and its world. And I'm going to step through each of these and talk about how these influenced our ideas and the development and our prototypes. These statements, initially, our goal was to try and get crisp on what exactly is the definition of the DNA of this franchise. But it ultimately served as the pillars for what this game is. I'll start with tone. Now, tone is wide-reaching. It affects how the game looks. It affects how the game sounds. It affects how the story is told. But before we go into these wider-reaching aspects of the game, we had to find the center, the core, the foundation in which we could grow everything out. And that starts with Crash as a character himself. And the statement that we have for tone is that it's Jackass meets Looney Tunes. It's a game about just barreling into danger And it's got the silliness and the wackiness of Looney Tunes, and this is the original inspiration for the series, and harkening back towards that original DNA. So starting with Crash, we looked at the series, and Crash over the years has actually evolved quite a bit. He's retained some core elements about him, like his color and the way he wears pants and his red shoes, but he's actually made some pretty drastic changes over time. Now, we know that the game is about a continuation of the original's trilogy, and so we want to focus on the first three expressions. And the Insane Trilogy, the remasters, did an amazing job of going back to that source and bringing it up to modern standards and to a whole new level of fidelity. So it seemed like one thing that we were asking ourselves was, why not just take that look and continue it? Now, the reason why we didn't was because one thing that we agreed on and aligned very early on is that we didn't want this new game to be perceived as a sequel to a remaster or a DLC extension to a remaster. There had to be an immediate, just at a glance, understanding that this is a new expression, this set itself apart from the remasters, that this was a game for 2020. And so we were already early on a path to presenting a new interpretation for Crash. Now we've got this amazing team of artists, and before we did put any pencil to paper, we also looked at some of the surrounding media that influenced our impressions and our memories of who Crash is. Now, there's obviously the Crash mascot guy in the commercials that we all love. There's internet memes more recently. Crash has his own manga. He's been a guest star on TV shows like Skylanders. So all of these are different ingredients we want to make sure that we incorporated because they're a part of the fabric of who we remember and how we remember what Crash is. Now, our art director tasked our amazing and talented artists with going really, really wide and pushing the envelope with the interpretation for Crash, starting from a safe interpretation to really, really pushed and challenging convention. And we gave them targets. So we were looking for a cute version of Crash Bandicoot, a more edgy version, something that's a little bit more heroic. And we also gave freedom for personal interpretation to just go where your heart takes you with how you remember Crash. And as we got all these drawings together, we could see a lot of the commonality of these drawings. And that formed the center of who we believed he was. And we selected a handful of drawings and poses that represented the facets of Crash's personality, and ultimately asked a single artist to interpret this down into a single style. Now, these poses and this sheet ultimately served as the model sheet for the 3D sculpt that we see here today. Now, another thing that we know that this game is that it's a cartoon, and we know from the original developers at Naughty Dog that their ambitions for the title was for it to be a living cartoon and harken back to Looney Tunes. And so we looked at that source and we made sure that as we built out our designs and we built out our models and our rigs, that our animators were equipped to really push this level of Tex Avery-like deformation and to get that extreme movement to simulate that motion blur to get that silkiness and that clarity of interpolation into our aesthetic. Now, physical humor is fantastic. It's great. It's universal. But we also want to make sure that we are specifically speaking to our audience of 25 to 40-year-olds. And we do that in a number of ways. In one sense, what we did was in some of the namings and for the skins or the titles for the levels, we added in some suggestions of innuendo to make sure that we've got things that might sail over a kid's head, but it's a little wink at our audience for 25 to 40-year-olds. We introduced situations that were a little bit more edgy in nature, but it didn't push it too far. But like the fact that Entropy takes his level of narcissism to a whole new level with this creepy, incestuous love for his multiverse self. And we also wrote dialogue in the way to make sure that this game was very self-aware and was making reference to its own past, the fact that it is a game, that it has a history, like this joke that's kind of acknowledging the fact that it's ignoring some of the other sequels that are coming after this in its chronological timeline. Now, our statement for gameplay is tense, precise execution. And just like with tone, before we built out and made sure that this affected all aspects of game design, we needed to find a home base, and that was in Crash himself. Ultimately, with Crash as a game, we want to make sure that the core verbs of jump, spin, slide, slam is really, really satisfying to pull off. It feels familiar. One of the original appeals of this set is that it's super, super approachable, and yet the title is very challenging and very demanding, and it really asks a lot of skill and it really asks you to master the game through skill. At its best, it is hard but fair. And one thing, as we started to block out certain levels, we found that it's just inherently difficult to land to just understand depth as you're jumping to and from perspective. And so one thing that we did pretty early on was to try to figure out how can we preserve the level of difficulty, but make sure that the player has all the tools and the information at hand to land these really very difficult precision asks. And so we actually added a very overt indicator underneath Crash so that at any time you know precisely where you're going to land. And we had a ton of ideas and prototypes in terms of new mechanics and new abilities for Crash, new vehicles, new playable heroes. But there was some blurriness in terms of how an ability, depending on how it's framed, it could easily have been a vehicle, it could have easily been a new hero. So it was important for our design team to make sure that there's a separation in function, not just in theme, between all these different ideas. So they all had very specific individual lanes that they occupied. For example, with new abilities, this was, we isolated these to the new quantum masks, and these abilities were always going to be triggered on a button, and they always added on top of the core verbs of run, jump, spin, slide, slam. On the other hand of things, there's new vehicles. It was almost like a subtraction of control. And then you've got new things like wall running and grind railing, and completely new heroes like Dingodile or Neocortex that is just a completely different approach to interacting with these core elements like Wumpa or crates, or even just the feel of how you Crash is a character that just barrels through danger, but Neocortex is more cerebral, and so those levels presented an opportunity to introduce more puzzly elements that you would have to think through before you executed on. So this gave us once we understood and identified these individual lanes, we knew what the ingredients were for the game, and we started to lay them out on this. It essentially is a roadmap of the entire game, level by level. And we put this giant physical board in the office. It was very unavoidable on your way to your desk. Everyone was constantly having conversation around this. And we were playing with the sequencing of levels, how they would flow into each other. It influenced how we told the story. It influenced as well. We did breakdowns of the different sequences and sections within a level as well, so we could see of the ingredients that we're sprinkling in, how we could be strategic and deliberate about inserting novelty and new mechanics. So one thing that was really important is that we're expecting that if you're going to play a game that's called Crash Bandicoot, that the vast majority of the time is going to be about how satisfying it is to play Crash. And we didn't want this to be oversaturated with new experiences or new heroes that might not be as interesting to you. So this was a really great way as a high-level approach to make sure that we could seed them very deliberately, that we built up on the difficulty in a way that stacked on each other, and that just everything fit together in a way that always went back to complementing the core Crash gameplay. This also influenced some ideas that we had, some presumptions that we had about the game. Like we presumed that there was going to be a warp room structure for the game. And if you're not familiar with warp rooms are essentially little hubs where there are maybe 5 or 6 different level nodes that you could approach in any order that you choose. And once you've completed the majority of those, you could move on to the next warp room. Now, we presumed that we were going to inherit this coming from Crash 3. But as we started to lay out some of our other goals, like wanting this to be very challenging but fair, and we also wanted to tell a linear story, and as we start to sequence things on the our campaign roadmap, it became very difficult by allowing the player to access different levels at different times without introducing a lot of complex things that would be tuning the experiences in a variable way on the other levels. So we actually went back on this and said, this game is actually going to go back to a very linear structure, and it benefits us so that we could be tighter, and the experiences that the player just completed could be more reliable, so we could build on those. So that also influenced our approach to difficulty. Tense, precise execution, it says hard, right? It says difficult. And one of our presumptions was that we were going to introduce a difficulty selection, that you could start this game and say, if you wanted to play really difficult, you could choose hard. If you wanted it easier, you could play that. But it turns out platformer is a little bit more difficult to tune in that way. Like, for an example, as a combat game, you have options, numeric options to tune up your hit points or your combat effectiveness. But the platformer, if you've got a gap in the ground, and it's the level, it's the world that's built very specifically to specific metrics, tuning the difficulty of that gap in the ground that you have fall to death is it's difficult to do. And we were exploring different ideas of layering on things that would make things easier so that you could undo a death, or maybe you could fly over certain things, or had some currency that gave you some ability to bypass some of these challenges. But we found that it was going against our original intention of preserving the game's difficulty but being fair. So after lots and lots of exploration and prototyping, we ultimately landed on a place in which we split out the play style into two different things, not difficulty, but play style, so that players could choose a modern mode, which had unlimited lives, but you could always reset to the last checkpoint. The difficulty and the challenge of the levels were preserved, but you could always try again. And in retro, we had the classic behavior of introducing limited lives. And if all your lives expired, we would start you as a hard reset at the beginning of the level. So again, challenges preserved across both options, but in this way, the player was able to choose the level of punishment or masochism for this game, respecting both a modern approach to things and what was nostalgic for the experience. And finally, on world, our statement here is that this game is a colorful, dangerous universe. This is probably the most straightforward of all the pillars, because what Crash and the classic games were already started at such a high point, and we just looked for opportunities in which we could tap into that and dial it to 11. So one of many people's memories, myself included, about the original games was that they were surprisingly lush and detailed and packed with just detail that weren't seen in other platforms of that time. Now, obviously, we're not constrained by hardware in the same way. We wanted to make sure that we tapped into that same memory and same feeling. And so we very deliberately built out opportunities that exploited this, or highlighted the fact that we built out these new environments that were way more detailed, had way more storytelling involved, that compelled you on this journey towards the very end. The classic games, this is probably one of the most iconic moments of the Crash series, is this boulder chase that's running towards the camera. And we wanted to make sure that we tapped into that nostalgia, but again, dial it up to 11 on this. So how do you take something that's exciting like this and take it to the next level? Well, you take that ball and you turn it into a live ghost character, a spirit monster that's chasing after you. We make sure that every single beat that he's interacting and smashing with the environment, that we're tuning the rubber banding so that it is so precise in such a way that it always guarantees a very, very narrow escape in that experience. In the bosses, what was formerly a hopscotch exercise that was over in a matter of minutes, we dialed this up to be larger than life, into a multi-phase escalation of ultimate tests that really asked challenging questions of all the skills that you picked up and mastered along the way. Now, with all of this novelty, and these new worlds, we made one thing that we did to ground these new environments and experiences was to make sure that we sprinkled in a bunch of Easter eggs throughout the game. Made sure that there's enough detailed for eagle-eyed fans, but also to tap into the richness of the IP that didn't get an opportunity in the main storyline, or just it would have been too crammed if we tried to pull in all of the interesting characters and then tell a compelling story of it through there. We even took this to a point of integrating this the woe meme that's taken over the internet in the past, and making a beat out of this to really highlight and again wink to the core fan base. So that takes me to the end of this talk. Out of these three pillars and statements about DNA, these did not change from the very beginning to the end, and they were very, very useful for us to always go back to as a measurement of are we aligned in the things that we're adding to this game. Underneath all of these statements, though, I would say that it was really, really important for us to listen to the fans. This is ultimately a love letter to the fans, and so it's really important that we spend a lot of time listening in on the community boards, on Reddit, on Discord, just to hear people's nostalgia, their fondness for these classic games, and also their wishes for what a new game was. We also, I think it was really, really important for us and really helpful for us to also hire fans as well. We had representation of really, really hardcore fans in each of the teams, and that was incredibly useful to have as we introduced new ideas, to always have a gut check, someone we could just walk on over to or call up to check and see if we were straying off or being off-brand or inauthentic in our decisions. So that takes me to this little plug here, is that at Toys for Bob, we are hiring both fans and developers, or if you're a developer and a fan of titles like Crash 4 and Call of Duty Warzone. If you're looking for more information, please take a look at this website at careers.toysforbob.com, especially as we're looking towards celebrating more in this 25th anniversary of Crash Bandicoot this year. And if you got any questions about these roles, or about this talk, this is me. Please feel free to contact me. And thanks if you made it this far. Thanks for listening in. And I hope you learned a little bit more about the development of Crash Bandicoot 4.